I'm pleased to welcome for the interview section on Mijas International freelance writer and author, and that's Julie McSorley. And she lives in Spain. In fact, she's a Mijas Costa resident, has lived there for 6 years. She enjoys writing and painting, and she was an art student as well in the 1960s, which was quite exciting, I imagine. And she has written a book with her son, Marcus McSorley, who is an actor from theatre, short films, commercials, and even Shakespeare. And it's called Out of the Box, and it's about the life of the controversial former Commonwealth Games athlete Reg Spiers, who returned to Australia in 1964 in a box. Good afternoon, Julie.
Hello, Karen.
Hello. It's a great true story for a book, isn't it? It's certainly grabbed people's attention.
It has. It's actually a story that's 50 years old. And I think why we came to think that we had to put this in a book is that nobody had done it before. And we were absolutely amazed at that.
And, I mean, taking you back a little bit, Reg Spiers was a friend of your husband, wasn't he?
Yeah,
Who's
he was.
John McFarlane.
John McSorley.
John
yes.
McSorley, that's it, John McSorley.
Yes.
And he was a javelin thrower as well, wasn't he?
He was. They were both really top javelin throwers. Reg was actually won the national javelin championships for Australia a couple of times, and he was certainly one of the forerunners of throwers. My husband John was, again, one of the top British javelin champions, and they first met at the Commonwealth Games in 1962, which was actually held in Perth, Australia.
Right, yeah.
And John, you know, kept in touch. I guess those days you didn't have email or anything like that.
Yeah.
So they were sort of pen friends, I suppose, because you're talking 1960s.
Yeah, there would be pen friends, wouldn't there?
Yeah. And then one day, out of the blue, Reg appears on John's doorstep in Twickenham, you know, and real Aussie larrikin, and really took Twickenham by storm, by all accounts. People had not experienced a personality like that.
Yeah, he was like a big personality, wasn't he?
Big personality, very handsome young guy. I mean, what one has to remember is these guys were 22 at the time. They were very young. Yeah. And Reg really wanted to try out for the Commonwealth Games, but he had really bad injuries. He would have made the Commonwealth Games if it wasn't for that, and then desperately had to get back to Australia.
And he didn't have any money, did he? He was penniless.
He had no money. He'd had his wallet stolen. He was actually working at the airport at the time, at Heathrow. And one night, they concocted this mad plan how Reg would travel home for free. And so my husband, John, being a great friend of his and was very good at carpentry, was commandeered to build Reg a box. And he built a box, the biggest size that was allowed in those days. And Reg Julie got in the box with his suitcase and some provisions. Yeah. And they took him to the airport and sent him as air freight.
Goodness. Now, how big was this box?
The box was 5.5 by 4 by 3.5, and it was basically not quite coffin shaped.
No, we've just seen it on the screen there. No,
yeah.
I mean, if you're claustrophobic, you'll have an awful time.
Terrible time. He could actually only sit up with his legs straight, or lie down with them bent.
Goodness.
And so for 63 hours, that was quite an ordeal. But of course, Reg being Reg, he wasn't going to stay in the box.
Right.
So he actually got out in the hold. And we try and describe this in the book, what it must have been like.
Yeah.
He exercised, he ate canned food, he checked out his fellow freight. As you do. Yeah. And
well, he'd have been bored, wouldn't he?
So he would have been bored,
yeah.
But of course the plane stopped at various places. France, stopped again in Singapore, India. India was probably the most dramatic place because Reg's box was going to be offloaded and put on another plane. And it was a little bit of a problem, and he was ended up dangling on a forklift in the midday sun. Then got put aside to wait to be loaded, and apparently it was just so hot. he actually had to totally strip off.
Oh, gosh.
So here we have a mad Aussie, totally naked, in a box, on the tarmac of Bombay Airport, with, you know, Indians eating curry and, you know, and having their lunch break. So, I mean, it was just ripe for a book, wasn't it?
Oh, definitely, definitely.
Some real time.
So he would have arrived completely dehydrated, wouldn't he?
Yes, he had drink, but it ran out.
Yeah.
And of course, having arrived at the other end, then you have the problem that you have to get out of the box, get out of the warehouse, and get out of the airport, because he didn't want to be sort of found out.
No, and he wasn't, was he?
No, not until he got home to Adelaide. And Perth and Adelaide are a long distance apart. People that haven't been to Australia don't understand what a vast country Australia is.
Because you're Australian yourself.
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
And so, you know, it was a couple of days' journey. But just the idea of getting out of the airport, I mean, he broke out of his box, which had removable ends. John had built it with removable ends so that should he get wedged, because it was actually quite dangerous if you think about it.
Yeah.
He could kick the bottom out, and then he wanted to put on a suit so he looked respectable like the other travellers.
Yeah.
And the wonderful
That's amazing.
I know. The wonderful thing is, of course, in those days, Perth was a very small airport. And there were a lot of domestic flights, and of course you don't need your passport for a domestic flight. But of course he did have a passport, so he just tagged along with everybody else and got out and thumbed a lift to get him on the highway.
Yeah.
And then ended up not being able to get a lift across the Nullarbor, because the Nullarbor Desert, or the Nullarbor Plain, is vast, and a lot of the truckies don't want to take hitchhikers because they have to feed them and they have no money.
Oh, right.
So
yes.
Reg couldn't actually get a lift. So he used the one thing he had in his favour, and that was that he'd been a Catholic choir boy. And so he went to a Catholic church, and a priest took pity on him and shouted him the train fare back to Adelaide.
Oh, that's great, isn't it?
Yeah, just amazing.
Yeah.
Quite an amazing
But you said
story.
he wasn't found out till he got to Adelaide.
No.
Yeah.
No. What happened was, so basically, his family in Australia weren't expecting him back because they hadn't heard from him. So there was John in London biting his nails and thinking, you know, has he died en route? If he has, it's my fault.
Yeah, can you imagine how he was feeling?
Yeah. And Reg had absolutely promised that he would, you know, as soon as he got home, let him know that he was all right. But Reg got caught up in the euphoria of everything that he forgot to say anything. So John went along to a friend of his at the Times in London, who was a guy who was actually, I think it was Times and the Telegraph. He was James Coote, who was a sports correspondent at the time. Explained the situation. And apparently, I mean, we've got this in the book, but this is how it happened. The correspondent phoned up a friend who was a journalist in Australia, and you can imagine this phone conversation. So the guy in Australia is on the other end of the phone, and he's saying, "What? In a box?" And then he said, "And who was it?" And James Coote said, "Reg Spiers." And the guy said, "Reg Spiers? Okay, I believe it now." Which I think is a lovely story. And then, of course, the story broke, and it was, you know, front page on a lot of newspapers. It went all around.
It went viral, as we'd say nowadays.
It went viral, yes. Much the same, in the same way that the story actually went viral in March last year.
Yes, when the book was out.
Well, it was really, the BBC and everything, and then it sort of caught on, and suddenly everybody was very interested to hear this amazing story that happened so long ago. But yeah, Reg became a bit of an overnight sensation in Australia. He then could supplement his income, because he was on a lot of chat shows. He became a male model. Yeah. He modelled for a lot of the big sort of Australian magazines. But of course that doesn't last forever. But in those days, of course, sportsmen weren't subsidised.
No, they weren't, were they? They had to be extremely dedicated because
Absolutely.
they didn't get any extra money for it.
No, and we actually mentioned that at the beginning of the book. We have a foreword by Lynn Davis, the president of UK Athletics, who remembered Reg and is a good friend of John's, and he actually just gives a little backdrop to what athletics was like in those days, because I think a lot of people probably thought, well, how come he didn't have any money? I mean, if Reg and John had been as talented as they were, and young people now, they would probably, you know, have lots of sponsorship.
Yes, yeah.
But everybody had to have another job in those days.
That's very true.
Yeah.
Now, there's lots more in the book as well. He was quite a notorious character. You know, the adventure doesn't stop there when he arrived back in Australia. And as you said, getting extra income through being a model, through giving talks. But I think we'll leave the extras for the people who are going to be reading the book, because they're quite interesting. Some of the things he got up to. Definitely an extrovert. It
is interesting, and I mean, we can whet people's appetite and say that, you know, the culminating part of all the extra years that followed the box was probably being on death row in Sri Lanka. And, you know, the book describes about how he actually lived to tell the tale, and it's certainly an interesting story. He's led a lot of lives for one man, that's for sure.
The same as a cat, 9 lives.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, Julie, you're a freelance illustrator and writer. Have you written any other books, and are you in the middle of writing anything now?
We're in the middle of writing another book at the moment. This is a work of fiction. I would say it would be the genre of probably Gone Girl, Girl on a Train, if you know that kind of genre. So really a thriller. We decided we'd like to you know, try our hand at fiction as well, because, you know, when you have a true story, you have something on a plate. But having said that, there are other true stories that we'd like to consider. We're certainly really interested in some of the sort of legends, for example, of rock climbing, mountaineering, etc. And there's some great characters. And a lot of those stories actually haven't been dramatised. So I think it's actually really nice to sort of dramatise a true story, so people aren't reading it as a biography.
No, it's
which
a story.
Can be a bit crusty. Yeah.
Reading it as a story of their lives.
Yes, with speech and the way that you would actually read a work of fiction.
Yeah.
So that's what we're involved with at the moment.
That's with your son, isn't it?
Yes.
Marcus McSorley.
We've sort of got a winning combination of working together. It's actually a lot of fun to share a creative enterprise with somebody.
Yeah, and family too, even better.
Yeah, family is really nice, and we tend to bounce ideas off each other very well. So I think it's quite a privilege to be able to do something like that with your own child.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And is it the first book that you've been involved with?
It's the first book in terms of writing. I actually illustrated a children's book for Angus and Robertson that was shortlisted for Book of the Year in Australia, a children's book. I've written a lot of short stories, etc., but this is actually the first book, and I hope it'll be the first
one of many.
Several, hopefully, because it's certainly something I enjoy. Working as an illustrator, obviously, I had a lot of work published. I worked in Fleet Street in the 70s. I illustrated for Woman's Own. A lot of those magazines, a lot of people won't remember, like Over 21, 19 magazine, and had a lot of work published for a couple of years there before I eventually went into teaching, and then really became an academic and wrote then a lot of academic
pieces,
articles for magazines. But this is much more fun
than
the academic stuff, definitely.
I'll bet it is. And we saw earlier the trailer for Out of the Box book, and it won an award, didn't it? It's very atmospheric.
It's very atmospheric, and that is actually Marcus, my co-author, acting in that. Which we liked.
Because of course it starts. the actual trailer with the box and telling the story. But it makes it like a suspense thriller, doesn't it?
It does, and a lot of the original photographs and newspaper items gives it a sort of quite a feel of
an edge to it.
It really does, and no, we were really pleased with the way the trailer worked out. We had a lot of nice response about it, which was good.
And how long did it take? Was it Marcus himself that did it by himself? He put the trailer together.
No, he worked with a guy from Cyprus who we call Eugene. I can never pronounce his name. He's a very, very talented filmmaker, and Marcus had worked with him on something else when he was doing some other acting assignments. Loved his work so much, and really enjoyed, doing this with him. The creativity, a lot of that has come from Eugene. We basically said the elements that we'd like in it, and we scripted it.
Okay.
So we scripted it, but there's so much more
that goes into it.
Absolutely. Good camera work.
Yeah, excellent.
And they rebuilt a box. They rebuilt the box to the exact specifications of the original one, which was nice.
Yeah. And is Reg still with us?
Reg is still with us.
Great.
He's been to visit us in Spain 3 times in the last 6 years. He came out for John's 70th birthday a few years ago, and actually he was out just before Christmas, so just at the end of 2015. And we're going to meet up with him in Rome in a couple of months for a few days. He's got on some sort of cruise and docking in Rome for a few days. So we thought he's made so much effort to come out here and see us.
You're going to go and meet him.
We ought to make an effort. Yeah, but he's in fine fettle, hasn't lost any of his charm. He's still the same personality. He's a lovable rogue.
Yes, and perhaps if he comes to visit you later on in Spain, here in Mijas Costa, we might be able to have him on the programme as well.
I'm sure he'd be delighted.
That'd be lovely. Well, thank you very much, Julie, and all the best with your new project as well.
Thank you so much, Karen. My pleasure. Thank you.
And that's all for this afternoon on Mijas International. We'll be back with you at the same time tomorrow, and you're going to be lucky because Chef Steve Saunders is going to be preparing a new recipe for you. So until tomorrow, hasta mañana.